Well, hi there. I'm here today with Dr. Steve Fisher of the University of Oxford, and we're going to talk a little bit about the recent 2010 UK general election. Well, thanks very much for coming along. Perhaps we could start by talking a little bit about the context and the background to this election.
Okay, well, since the 2005 election, which Tony Blair won and got a clear majority of 66, we've had changes of leadership for all three major parties. Most noticeably, Tony Blair, after 10 years in power, handed over to Gordon Brown, who was the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And we've also had major economic crisis, financial crisis, and expenses scandal, and the result of all of these events for the opinion polls meant that the Conservatives have been ahead for the past couple of years and have gone into the campaign in the lead.
So, how did the campaign unfold then?
So, as I said at the start of the campaign, we have clear ordering of the parties, with the Conservatives had Labour second and Liberal Democrats third. One of the major innovations of this campaign is the first leadership debate, and there were three debates, each on a Thursday, 1 week apart, over the 4 weeks of the campaign. Now, the first debate really introduced Nick Clegg, the Liberal Democrat leader, to a lot of people who might not have known who he was before, and he seemed to do very well and clearly impressed people. Liberal Democrat support went up in the polls by about 10 points just almost overnight. Now, after that, the Liberal Democrat support in the polls held fairly steadily, drifted downwards slightly, but they were neck and neck with Labour for much of the last 3 weeks of the campaign, almost to election day. And debate about that and the consequences of that really dominated the campaign.
Okay, so what were the major issues then in this campaign?
So, well, as I was saying, the leaders' debate dominated things, and because the leaders' debate in some ways pointed towards a hung parliament, and people became interested in what the parties might do if there was a hung parliament. A lot of discussion about leaders' debates and what would happen after the election in terms of coalition formation or otherwise if there was a hung parliament sort of took over from the normal debate about policy issues somewhat. To the extent that there was still debate about policy issues, it was dominated by the economy, which was objectively in some ways the most important issue, and also it was clear from the polls that it was what the public was concerned most about. And there were two main threads to that. One was how to keep Britain out of recession and to improve economic growth. The second was how to reduce the deficit that the government had built up. Other issues that concerned the public were immigration. There had been large-scale immigration to Britain over the past 10 years, most notably from new European Union member states, crime, the NHS, the health service, and education. And issues like the Afghanistan war were actually very low-key, and all the normal issues that you'd expect in any election campaign obviously did get some mention along the way.
So how would you characterise the ideological divisions between the parties then?
Well, the big idea in the Conservative manifesto was called the Big Society, which was a bit of a return to individual responsibility and groups of citizens in society organising things for themselves. So a classic example of that was one of their flagship policies on groups of citizens and parents organising their own schools if their local educational authority wasn't providing the schools that they thought were good enough, and these schools could be publicly funded. This is a system modelled on a Swedish policy. The Labour manifesto was noticeably more confident in asserting the value of the state in improving welfare and the virtues of public spending and public services, and much more confident than previous New Labour manifestos have been since 1997. In many ways, the Liberal Democrat manifesto was most obviously redistributionist, calling for a rise in the income tax threshold to £10,000 and so severely reducing taxes for lower paid employees, but actually increasing taxation on better paid people.
So in a nutshell, what was the outcome of this election then?
So in terms of the share of the vote for the three major parties, it was fairly clear. The Conservatives were ahead with 36% of the vote, Labour on 29%, and the Liberal Democrats slightly above their 2005 share on 23%, but no significant advance despite all the excitement of the campaign pointing to them doing much better. In terms of seats, we had a hung parliament, so no party got an overall majority, which is the first time we've had this since February 1974. And the totals for each party were the Conservatives were on 306, which is 19 short of an overall majority. Labour were on 258, and the Liberal Democrats were on 57. So key finding there, thing to note there is that the Liberal Democrats and the Labour Party between them did not have an overall majority of the 650 seats in the UK Parliament, and so a coalition between them would actually also need some support for some of the many minor parties. In the event, what we got was a minimum winning coalition of the Conservatives and Liberal Democrats that formed 5 days after the election. We're used to getting governments the day after the election, and so the spectacle of coalition discussions and haggling between parties was actually rather novel for the British public.
I think it's true to say that there were several parties that actually achieved representation in this Parliament. So perhaps could you tell me something about those parties?
That's right, and in fact the share of the vote for the parties other than the Conservatives, Labour and Liberals was the highest level it's been since the Great Reform Act of 1832. It was at 12%. Now some of these parties reflect the divided nature of the United Kingdom into England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. In Northern Ireland we have the nationalist and unionist communities, and there we saw the Democratic Unionist Party and Sinn Féin, the two largest parties in the Northern Ireland Assembly, solidify and maintain their positions as the two largest parties in their communities. We did see the Alliance take one seat from the DUP, and most notably the DUP leader, Peter Robinson, who's been beset by scandals over finances. In Scotland and in Wales, the nationalist parties did roughly the same as they did in 2005, but in terms of share of the vote, and Plaid Cymru in Wales managed to get an extra seat. In terms of the really minor parties in England, or actually across Britain, but notable in England, the Green parties got their first seat in the House of Commons, but their share of the vote overall went down, and the two right-wing minor parties, the British National Party, the Anti-Immigration Party, and the Eurosceptic UK Independence Party, they actually increased their share of the vote in places they fought last time and fielded more candidates than before, and their share of the vote went up.